Dust clings to everything in Copper Springs, Arizona. 1887. Elizabeth Pearson stands on her porch, shoulders weighted by 3 years of widowhood and a homestead slowly crumbling, without a man's touch. When a lone Apache appears at her gate, hollow-cheeked and desperate, the townsfolk whisper warnings. But Elizabeth sees something in his weathered face: dignity, despite desperation. She offers him work fixing her broken fence line. He accepts with a silent nod. What begins as a simple transaction soon reveals itself as something more profound. As his skilled hands rebuild her boundaries, something else begins to change. The fence isn't the only thing being mended on the Pearson homestead, but why would a proud Apache warrior be reduced to begging for work from a white widow? Could the tragedy that connects them heal the wounds that divide them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over Copper Springs with the same tired tears that Elizabeth felt in her bones. She pulled her weathered shawl tighter as she stepped onto the porch, surveying the land that was both her burden and salvation. 3 acres of stubborn Arizona soil that had once held such promise when Thomas was alive. Elizabeth twisted the gold band on her finger, a habit formed over 20 years of marriage and strengthened in the 3 years since his passing. The small homestead looked back at her with accusatory eyes, a sagging roof corner, a chicken coop that needed mending, and that endless broken fence line that marked her property's surrender to the elements. "Coffee's ready," James called from inside, his voice caught between boyhood and the man he was too quickly becoming. "Coming, sweetheart," she answered, her eyes still fixed on the fence. Inside, 12-year-old James had the table set, his father's place conspicuously empty. The boy had his father's eyes, deep-set and thoughtful, but they'd grown older than his years since the funeral. He poured her coffee with careful precision. "Mrs. Hollingsworth asked if we're coming to Sunday service," he said, sliding into his chair. Elizabeth nodded. "We always do." Sunday meant respectability. It meant the town seeing they were managing. It meant visiting Thomas's grave with fresh wildflowers, even when winter made them scarce. After breakfast, Elizabeth walked James to the schoolhouse in town. Copper Springs wasn't much: a main street with a general store, the sheriff's office, Dr. Peterson's practice, a small church, and scattered businesses that served the ranchers and miners. Everyone knew everyone, which was both comfort and curse. "Morning, Elizabeth." Sheriff Miller tipped his hat as they passed. His eyes lingered a moment too long on her face. "Sheriff," she nodded politely. John Miller had been asking to call on her for nearly a year now. She'd politely deferred, not ready to invite another man's shadow to fall where Thomas's still seemed so present. At the general store, Sam Bailey's smile faded slightly when she approached the counter. "Elizabeth, what'll it be today?" "Just flour and sugar, Sam. Perhaps a bit of coffee if you can add it to my account." The storekeeper's hesitation was brief, but noticeable. "Account's getting a bit heavy, Elizabeth. The chickens are laying well. I'll bring eggs next week," she promised, the familiar heat of shame warming her cheeks. Outside, she overheard Walt Prescott talking with other ranchers. "Injun's been spotted north of town again," he said, his voice carrying intentionally. "Government ought to keep them on their reservation, where they belong." The men murmured agreement, eyes sliding to Elizabeth as she passed. The Apache reservation was a sore subject. 30 miles away, but close enough for comfort. The railroad had made everything closer these days. Back home, Elizabeth spent the afternoon washing laundry until her knuckles were raw and pink. Each garment she hung was a small victory against entropy. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain that rarely delivered. That evening, as James completed his schoolwork by lamplight, Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's old ledger. The numbers refused to cooperate, more going out than coming in. Without a man's wages, the homestead was slowly bleeding dry. "We need to fix that fence," James said suddenly, looking up from his slate. "Coyotes got another chicken last night." Elizabeth nodded. "I know, sweetheart. I could try," he offered, his shoulders squaring with determination. "It's hard work for a grown man," she said gently. "Your father spent weeks on that fence." James looked down. "I'm not a baby anymore." Elizabeth reached across to touch his hand. "No, you're not, but I need you focusing on your studies. That's what your father would want." Later, after James was asleep, Elizabeth stood at the window, watching the moon cast silver light across the broken fence line. She twisted Thomas's ring again, the gold warm from her constant touch. "What would you have me do?" she whispered to the empty room. The question hung unanswered in the still air of the house. Outside, a coyote's lonely call echoed across the valley. Elizabeth knew that feeling well, surrounded by others, yet utterly alone. Tomorrow would be another day of the same struggles, the same memories, the same slow decline that had begun the moment the doctor had shaken his head over Thomas's fever-racked body. She turned from the window and blew out the lamp. In the darkness, her fingers found the wedding band once more. Some boundaries, like grief, couldn't be mended with hammer and nail. Others, like her fence, were just waiting for the right hands to rebuild them. The stranger appeared at the edge of Elizabeth's property like a mirage in the heat. Tall and lean, he stood motionless beside the broken fence line, his copper skin contrasting with the faded blue of a cavalry-issued shirt that had clearly seen better days. His long black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, revealing high cheekbones and eyes that held both weariness and dignity. Elizabeth froze, her basket of chicken feed suspended. She glanced toward the house where James was inside reading. No menfolk to call upon. Sheriff Miller was miles away in town. The man made no move to enter her property. He simply waited, one hand resting lightly on the broken fence post. "Can I help you?" Elizabeth called, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. "Work," he replied, his English clear but clipped. He gestured toward the fence. An Apache. Elizabeth had seen them occasionally in town, usually being escorted back to the reservation by cavalry soldiers. The townspeople kept their distance, conversations falling silent when they passed. "You're looking for work?" she asked. He nodded once. From his pocket, he withdrew a small deerskin pouch, opened it, and removed a few coins, not enough to buy a decent meal. "Town say no." His expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes spoke of hunger and exhaustion beneath the pride. Elizabeth considered him. Walt Prescott's warnings about savages echoed in her mind, yet before her stood not a threat, but a man seeking honest work, a man whose strong hands could repair what she could not. "Are you hungry?" she asked. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He hesitated, then nodded once. "Wait here." Elizabeth went inside, where James watched from the window. "Ma, there's an Indian out there," he whispered, eyes wide. "I know, sweetheart. He's looking for work." She gathered bread, cheese, and cold chicken onto a plate. "But Mr. Prescott says Prescott has 5 ranch hands and a whole fence crew." Elizabeth interrupted gently. "We have a broken fence and no money to hire the blacksmith's boy." Outside, the man hadn't moved. Elizabeth offered the plate, which he accepted with surprising grace. "I'm Mrs. Pearson, Elizabeth Pearson," she said. He studied her face before answering. "Dakota." He ate with deliberate dignity, despite his obvious hunger, taking measured bites. "That's an unusual name," Elizabeth ventured. "Dakota Sioux word, means friend to all." Something like irony flickered across his features. Apache mother, Sioux father. Elizabeth watched as he finished the food. "The fence needs repairing all the way around. It's 3 days' work for a strong man. I can pay a little, not much, and provide meals." Dakota nodded. "Fair trade." From inside, James watched with suspicion. Beyond the property, a rider passed on the main road, slowing to stare before continuing toward town. News would spread quickly. "You can sleep in the barn," Elizabeth said. "There's clean hay in the loft." As the sun set, Elizabeth prepared supper, glancing occasionally through the window. Dakota worked methodically, assessing the damage to each section of fence. His movements were efficient, measured, the motions of a man accustomed to physical labor. James set the table for two, pointedly ignoring the third person on their property. "He'll need to eat too," Elizabeth said quietly. "Not with us," James replied, his father's stubbornness evident in the set of his jaw. Elizabeth sighed. "No, not yet." Later, she brought a plate to the barn. Dakota sat cross-legged on the hay, eyes closed, the deerskin pouch open before him. A faint, sweet smell of burning herbs hung in the air. His eyes opened at her approach. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, offering the plate. "Prayers for the coming work," he explained, accepting the food. "Thank Creator for food and shelter." Elizabeth hesitated. "Will you have enough light to see in here?" "Moon is full tonight. Enough light." As she turned to leave, she paused. "The people in town, they're not bad people. They're just afraid," Dakota finished for her. "All people fear what they do not understand." Under the silver moonlight, Elizabeth returned to her house, feeling the eyes of neighbors watching from distant windows. Tomorrow would bring questions, judgment, perhaps even confrontation. Yet for the first time in months, she felt something like hope as she glanced back at the barn where a stranger named Friend to All had found temporary refuge. Inside, she checked on James, already asleep with a book about frontier adventures on his chest. She gently removed it, tucking the blanket around his shoulders. Outside their window, the broken fence waited for morning, for new hands to mend what had been left to ruin. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues when Elizabeth stepped onto her porch. Dakota was already at the fence line, studying its condition with calculating eyes. He had rolled his sleeves up, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. "Good morning," she called, carrying a small wooden chest. "These were my husband's tools." Dakota turned, nodding respectfully. He approached and accepted the chest with careful hands. "Thomas was particular about his tools," Elizabeth said, the name catching slightly in her throat. "Said a man's tools tell his story." Dakota opened the chest, examining each item with reverent fingers. Hammer, saw, awl, and measuring string. "Good tools," he said simply. "Well cared for." "He would have kept that fence in better repair," Elizabeth admitted. "I've tried. Wood speaks differently to different hands." Dakota replied. He selected the hammer, testing its weight. "These hands understand." From the kitchen window, James watched suspiciously. Elizabeth waved him outside. "James, Mr. Dakota will be working on our fence today. Perhaps you could show him where your father kept the extra fence posts." The boy approached reluctantly. "Behind the barn," he muttered, keeping his distance. Dakota nodded to the boy. "Good morning, James Pearson." James looked startled at being addressed so formally. "Morning," he replied automatically before retreating to the house. Elizabeth sighed. "He's still learning his manners. He protects his mother." "Honorable." Dakota pointed to several sections of the fence. "Wood here is good. Can be saved. There, new posts needed. By afternoon, corner will be strong again." The promise of tangible progress lightened Elizabeth's heart. "I'll bring water and food at midday." As morning stretched toward noon, Elizabeth divided her attention between household chores and watching Dakota work. His movements were methodical, almost meditative. He removed rotted posts with minimal disruption, salvaged what could be saved, and prepared the ground for new supports. By midday, James's curiosity had overcome his caution. Elizabeth found him sitting on the porch steps, watching Dakota demonstrate how to test wood grain for strength. "Lunch is ready," she announced, carrying a tray to the shade of the old oak tree. Dakota washed his hands in the basin she provided, then waited for Elizabeth and James to sit before joining them. The meal passed in relative silence until James unexpectedly asked, "How come you don't wear feathers?" "James," Elizabeth admonished. Dakota's eyes crinkled slightly. "Not all Apache dress the same. Not all white men wear the same hats." James considered this. "Do you know how to track animals?" "Yes." "And shoot a bow?" "Yes." "Have you ever scalped anyone?" "James Pearson." Elizabeth's face flushed with embarrassment. Dakota regarded the boy calmly. No, that is mostly white man's stories. Apache take few trophies. Life is sacred, even enemy's life. James absorbed this with visible disappointment at the less dramatic reality. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their meal. Walt Prescott rode up, his weathered face tightening at the domestic scene before him. "Elizabeth," he called, purposely not dismounting a subtle discourtesy. "Thought I'd check on you being out here alone and all. As you can see, Walt, I'm managing just fine." Elizabeth replied evenly. Prescott's eyes narrowed at Dakota, who had risen to his feet. "Didn't know you were hiring help. Mr. Dakota is repairing my fence. It's been needing attention since before Thomas passed. Folks in town might worry about you having a savage on your property," Prescott said, his friendly tone belying the hostility of his words. "Mr. Dakota has been nothing but respectful and hard-working," Elizabeth replied firmly. "I don't see how it's the town's concern who I hire." Prescott adjusted his hat. "Just neighborly concern, Elizabeth. Man in town saw him here yesterday. Talk spreads." "Let it spread then," Elizabeth said with more confidence than she felt. "Good day, Walt." After Prescott departed, Dakota returned to work without comment. By late afternoon, the northwest corner of the fence stood sturdy and true. As the sun began its descent, Elizabeth noticed something new. The end post now bore a small carved cap, a simple yet elegant design that hadn't been there before. "You made this?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Dakota nodded. "Apache blessing, for protection of home." "It's beautiful," she said, surprised by the craftsmanship. "Beauty makes strength last longer," he replied. As twilight gathered, Elizabeth watched from her kitchen as Dakota cleaned and carefully returned each tool to the chest. His reverence for her husband's possessions touched something in her respect, transcending the boundaries between their worlds. James appeared beside her at the window. "He fixed it better than it was before," the boy admitted grudgingly. Elizabeth rested her hand on her son's shoulder. Sometimes the best repairs come from unexpected hands. Saturday meant town, whether Elizabeth wanted to go or not. She pinned her hair neatly, sliding her mother's silver comb into place, the one luxury she allowed herself. Proper appearance mattered in Copper Springs, especially for a woman managing alone. "James, are you ready?" she called, adjusting her best dress. 3 years out of fashion, but meticulously maintained. "Do I have to come?" he asked, appearing in his Sunday clothes, hair slicked down with water. "Yes, we need supplies, and you need new pencils for school." The wagon ride to town was quiet, dust coating their clothes despite Elizabeth's careful brushing before departure. She'd left Dakota, continuing his work on the eastern fence line, his progress already impressive after 4 days. Copper Springs' main street bustled with Saturday activity. Ranch hands in town for supplies, families doing weekly shopping, women gathered in conversational clusters. Elizabeth felt the shift immediately. Conversations paused as they passed. Eyes followed them with undisguised curiosity. "Mornin', Mrs. Pearson," Harry Jenkins called from outside the barber shop, his tone overly casual. "Heard you got yourself some unusual help out at your place." "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Elizabeth replied evenly, steering James toward the general store. Inside, 3 women huddled near the fabric bolts. Mrs. Hollingsworth, the minister's wife, straightened when Elizabeth entered, her pinched face arranged in Christian concern. "Elizabeth, dear," she approached, voice lowered to a theatrical whisper, "is it true you've taken in one of those reservation Indians?" Elizabeth measured her words carefully. "I've hired a man to repair my fence, Agnes. He happens to be Apache." Mrs. Hollingsworth's eyes widened. "But surely you understand how inappropriate that appears. A woman alone with a savage." "He's hardly a savage," Elizabeth interrupted. "And I'm hardly alone. James is with me." "A 12-year-old boy is hardly protection," Mrs. Hollingsworth sniffed. "What would Thomas think?" The mention of her husband stiffened Elizabeth's spine. "Thomas would think our fence needed fixing, and that I made a practical decision." Sheriff Miller appeared beside them, nodding politely. "Ladies, Everything all right here? John, Mrs. Hollingsworth turned gratefully. Perhaps you could explain to Elizabeth the dangers of harboring an Indian, especially with those rumors of reservation escapees. I'm not harboring anyone, Sheriff, Elizabeth said firmly. I've hired a worker who's been nothing but respectful. Sheriff Miller rubbed his mustache thoughtfully. It's not against any law to hire help, Agnes. To Elizabeth he added quietly, though that might be wise to consider how it looks. Elizabeth, people talk. Let them, she replied, though her hand trembled slightly as she handed her list to Sam Bailey, behind the counter. The storekeeper reviewed her items, frowning. Your account's pretty high already, Elizabeth. I'll have extra eggs next week, and possibly some preserves to sell. Sam hesitated, then began gathering her items. Just don't make it a habit. As he worked, Elizabeth noticed he added extra coffee and sugar. His small kindness amid the town's judgment brought unexpected tears to her eyes, which she quickly blinked away. Across the store, Dr. James Pearson entered, nodding warmly to Elizabeth. Unlike most of Copper Springs residents, the doctor had traveled widely before settling in Arizona territory. His worldview extended beyond the town's boundaries. Mrs. Pearson, he greeted her. How's that cough of James? Much better with your tonic, thank you. The doctor lowered his voice. I hear you've hired some help. Good for you. That place is too much for one woman. Before she could respond, raised voices near the door caught everyone's attention. Should run that Indian off before he brings his people down on us. A miner was saying loudly, you know they can't be trusted. My cousin near Tucson lost his scalp to those devils. Elizabeth felt James press against her side, listening intently. Is that true, Ma? He whispered. About the scalping? Some men prefer exciting stories to truth, she murmured back. With their parcels finally gathered, Elizabeth paid what she could on her account and guided James outside. Sheriff Miller followed them to their wagon. Elizabeth, he said quietly, I can't tell you who to hire, but I'd be remiss not to warn you. There's talk of Apache raids north of here. Military's been through looking for escapees. Dakota has been working for me all week, she replied. He's hardly had time for raiding. Just be careful, Miller advised. And know my door's always open if you need help. The ride home seemed longer, the wagon heavier with unspoken worries. As they crested the hill overlooking their property, Elizabeth spotted Dakota working steadily, the fence line visibly straighter than it had been that morning. He's still there, James noted, sounding slightly surprised. Yes, Elizabeth replied. Still there. She touched her mother's silver comb, still secure in her hair despite the bumpy ride. Like the comb, she would remain firmly in place, regardless of the pressure to bend. 2 weeks passed, the days falling into a rhythm as predictable as Elizabeth's heartbeat. Each morning, Dakota appeared at first light, working until dusk, with a single-minded focus. The fence line now stood straight and strong along 3/4 of the property, each post secure, each rail properly seated. Elizabeth had taken to bringing lunch to wherever Dakota was working, rather than calling him to the house. Today, she carried a tray with cornbread, beans and sliced venison from a deer Sheriff Miller had brought by. A gesture she recognized as both kindness and an excuse to check on her situation. You've made remarkable progress, she said, setting the tray in the shade of a scrub oak. Dakota wiped his hands on a rag. We'll finish north section tomorrow. Then gates need work. She noticed how his frame had filled out slightly in the past weeks, good food restoring what hunger had taken. His eyes, too, seemed clearer, more present. James appeared from the direction of the creek, carrying a string of small fish. Ma, look what I caught. Well done, Elizabeth smiled. Those will make a fine supper. To her surprise, James turned to Dakota. I used that still fishing trick you showed me. Worked just like you said. Dakota nodded approvingly. Good fisherman learns patience. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. I didn't realize you two had been talking about fishing. James shrugged with feigned casualness. He knows stuff. Over the past days, she'd noticed James lingering near Dakota's work, asking occasional questions that had gradually evolved from suspicious interrogation to genuine curiosity. Dakota answered each with the same patient dignity, never talking down to the boy. "Will you both clean those fish?" Elizabeth asked. "I need to finish the bread for tonight." As she turned to leave, she made a decision. "Dakota, would you join us for supper tonight? At the table, I mean, not in the barn." He looked up, genuine surprise crossing his features. "You would share your table? You've shared your knowledge with my son," she replied. "And we've more than enough fish, it seems." That evening, Elizabeth set 3 places at the table for the first time since Thomas's death. James, freshly washed, kept glancing at the door. "Is he coming?" he asked for the 3rd time. "He said he would," Elizabeth answered, wondering herself. Perhaps she'd overstepped some boundary. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Dakota stood in the doorway, hair damp and tied back, wearing his cleanest shirt. In the lamplight, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small turquoise stone on a leather cord around his neck. "Thank you for inviting me," he said formally. James pulled out a chair. "You can sit here. It's where Pa used to sit, but he's not using it anymore." Elizabeth's breath caught, but Dakota seemed to understand the significance of the gesture. He nodded solemnly to James before taking the offered seat. The meal began awkwardly but warmed as they ate. James, surprisingly, carried much of the conversation, peppering Dakota with questions about Apache hunting techniques. "Can you really track animals over rock?" the boy asked, eyes wide. "Yes. All things leave signs, small dust patterns, bent grass. Disturbed insects," Dakota demonstrated with his hands. "World speaks if you learn to listen. Could you teach me, if your mother permits?" Elizabeth smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "I think that would be fine." As she served apple cobbler, she noticed Dakota absently touching the turquoise pendant. "That's a beautiful stone," she remarked. His fingers stilled. For a moment, he thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "From my wife." The simple statement opened a door. "You're married?" James asked. "Was," Dakota replied. "She walks with ancestors now, 3 winters past, like my pa," James said softly. Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest. "I'm sorry for your loss." Dakota nodded. "Now then." Her name meant beautiful. The stone was her mother's. "She gave it when our daughter was born." "You have a daughter?" Elizabeth asked gently. His eyes darkened. "Had." Reservation fever took both. His fingers closed around the stone. "All I have left." The simple statement contained such depth of loss that Elizabeth found herself reaching across the table, her hand stopping just short of his. "We understand loss here," she said softly. For the first time, Dakota's face softened into what might have been a smile. "Yes. You understand." The unexpected intimacy of shared grief hung in the air until hoofbeats sounded outside. Elizabeth rose, peering through the window to see Sheriff Miller dismounting. "Evening, Elizabeth," he called, then stopped short, seeing Dakota at the table through the open door. His hand instinctively moved toward his holster before settling at his side. "Sheriff," Elizabeth acknowledged, stepping onto the porch. "Is something wrong?" "Just making my rounds," he said, eyes still on Dakota, who had risen respectfully inside. "Thought I'd check on you. Didn't realize you had company." Behind her, James appeared. "We caught fish, Sheriff. Dakota showed me how." Miller's expression was unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Did he now?" "Evening, Sheriff," Elizabeth kept her voice steady. "Would you care to join us for cobbler?" Sheriff Miller removed his hat, eyes still fixed on Dakota. "Don't believe I will, thank you. Just wanted to make sure everything's in order." Dakota stood in the doorway, his posture respectful but unafraid. "Sheriff," Miller nodded curtly. "Didn't expect to find you at the family table." "I invited him," Elizabeth said firmly, "to thank him for his work on the fence." The sheriff's expression softened slightly when he looked at her. "Elizabeth, Might I have a word? Privately. Inside, James cleared the dishes with exaggerated noise while Elizabeth stepped into the yard with Miller. I understand he's been helpful, Miller began, voice low, but you need to consider appearances. A woman in your position can't afford to invite speculation. About what, exactly? Elizabeth's chin lifted. About showing basic Christian decency to someone who's worked hard for me. Miller sighed. You know that's not how folks will see it. There's already talk in town. Let them talk, Elizabeth replied, though her stomach tightened. The fence is nearly finished, and we've committed no impropriety. Just be careful, Miller warned. These aren't ordinary times. There's been trouble with Apaches north of here. Before Elizabeth could respond, the distant thunder of hoofbeats drew their attention. 6 riders approached in military formation, dust billowing behind them like storm clouds. Cavalry, Miller murmured, replacing his hat. Wonder what brings them this far from the fort. The riders pulled up sharply, their horses lathered from hard riding. The leader, a young lieutenant with a razor-straight posture, surveyed the property with cold efficiency. Sheriff Miller, he acknowledged. Lieutenant Reed, 5th Cavalry. We're tracking Apache renegades from the San Carlos Reservation. His eyes locked on Dakota, who had stepped onto the porch. I see you found one. Elizabeth moved protectively toward the porch. This man works for me, Lieutenant. He's been here for weeks. Reed dismounted, one hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. A button on his uniform caught the last light of day, tarnished from hard service. Ma'am, we have reports of Apaches who slipped the reservation 3 weeks back. Raided a settlement 2 days ago. Killed 2 settlers. His eyes never left Dakota. Your worker fits the description. That's impossible, Elizabeth protested. Dakota has been here every day, working from dawn to dusk. Dakota, Reed repeated the name, turning to one of his men. That match any names from the agent's list. The soldier consulted a crumpled paper. Could be one of them, sir. Agent's handwriting ain't the best. Sheriff Miller stepped forward. Lieutenant, I can vouch that this man has been seen working here regularly. Every day? Reed challenged. You've personally observed him every single day? Miller hesitated. Well, no, but then you can't vouch for his whereabouts during the raid. Reed turned back to Dakota. Where were you 2 nights ago? Here, Dakota answered calmly. Sleeping in barn. James suddenly appeared at Elizabeth's side. He was. I brought him extra blankets 'cause it got cold. Reed's expression softened slightly at the boy. Son, it's admirable you're defending him, but it's the truth. James insisted. He's been teaching me to fish and track. He couldn't have been raiding anybody. Elizabeth placed a hand on James's shoulder. My son doesn't lie, Lieutenant. Nor do I. If Dakota says he was here, he was here. Reed studied them, conflict evident in his young face. Finally, he straightened. I have orders to return all off-reservation Apaches to San Carlos. Papers? Dakota stood motionless. No papers. Then you're coming with us, Reed stated flatly. Lieutenant, Elizabeth protested. He's committed no crime. He's simply seeking honest work. Being off the reservation without authorization is crime enough, Reed replied. Those are my orders, ma'am. Sheriff Miller interceded. Lieutenant, I know this family. They're good people. If they say he's been here working, I believe them. Reed's jaw tightened, the tarnished button on his uniform catching the light as he shifted. I have my orders, Sheriff, and I have jurisdiction here, Miller countered, though his authority against the military was questionable at best. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Dakota stepped forward. I will show truth. He looked at Elizabeth. May I speak? Elizabeth nodded, heart pounding. I left reservation, Dakota acknowledged. Many die there. No food, disease. I came seeking work, not to raid. He gestured to the newly repaired fence. I build, not destroy. Reed looked genuinely conflicted. Finally he sighed. I'll need to report this. But, he glanced at the darkening sky. We've been riding hard. We'll make camp, and deal with this in the morning. As the soldiers withdrew to make camp nearby, Sheriff Miller turned to Elizabeth. "This isn't over. Reed's young, but he follows orders." Elizabeth watched Dakota return to the barn, his dignity intact despite the confrontation. "What will happen?" Miller's face was grim. "If they take him back to San Carlos, it won't be good. Those conditions." He didn't finish. "Then we won't let them take him," Elizabeth said quietly, surprising herself with her resolve. Long after James had gone to bed, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee between her hands. Through the window she could see the soldiers' campfire flickering in the distance, a malevolent eye watching her property. Sheriff Miller had departed reluctantly, promising to return at first light. His parting words echoed in her mind. "Elizabeth, whatever you're thinking, be careful. The army doesn't take kindly to civilians interfering with Indian affairs." A soft knock at the back door startled her. Dakota stood there, his face half-shadowed in the moonlight. "I should go," he said without preamble. "Bring trouble to your home." Elizabeth shook her head. "Come inside, please." Once seated across from her, Dakota seemed to choose his words carefully. "Soldiers will take me tomorrow. They said they escaped. Apaches raided a settlement," Elizabeth said. "But you've been here the whole time." "Yes, but others did escape. Hungry people do desperate things." His eyes met hers. "On reservation many die. Children first, the weak, then others." Elizabeth studied his face. "You did escape from the reservation, didn't you?" Dakota nodded once. "After my wife and daughter died, nothing left for me there. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have given work to reservation escapee?" His question held no accusation, only honesty. Elizabeth considered this. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know you now. I've seen your character." Dakota's fingers traced a pattern on the table, reminiscent of the designs he'd carved into her fence posts. "The settlement that was raided. I know these men. They were from my band. Good men once. Desperation changes people." "You didn't join them," Elizabeth observed. "I chose different path, to build, not destroy." His gaze traveled around her kitchen. "Found peace here I thought was lost forever." The weight of his words settled between them. Elizabeth rose, pacing to the window where she could see the soldiers' fire. "If they take you back, I will not survive long," he stated simply. "Reservation is slow death. They know I escaped once. We'll watch closely." Elizabeth turned back to him, her decision crystallizing. "Then we won't let them take you." Surprise flickered across Dakota's features. "Why would you risk trouble for me?" "Because it's right," she answered. And because she hesitated, unable to articulate the complex emotions that had developed over the past week. A sound from the hallway interrupted them. James stood in his nightshirt, a small wooden object clutched in his hand. "I heard talking," he said, approaching the table. "Are the soldiers going to take Dakota away?" Elizabeth sighed. "They want to, yeah." James thrust his hand forward, revealing a small wooden bear carving. "You can't go. You promised to show me how to make one of these." Dakota's expression softened as he looked at the carving he'd given the boy that afternoon. "Bear is protector, watches over those he cares for." "Then you're like the bear," James insisted. "You fixed our fence to protect us." Elizabeth felt unexpected tears prick her eyes at her son's simple wisdom. "James," she said gently, "this is a difficult situation. Lieutenant Reed has orders, but Dakota didn't do anything wrong." James protested. "He just doesn't want to die on the reservation like his family did." The blunt truth from her son's mouth made Elizabeth flinch. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know. That's why we're going to help him." James's face brightened. "Really?" "Yes," she said, looking at Dakota. "But we need a plan." Dakota shook his head. "Too dangerous for you. Military doesn't forgive those who hide Indians. They'd have to prove it," Elizabeth countered. "And Sheriff Miller seems sympathetic." "What about Dr. Pearson?" James suggested. "He likes Dakota. He told me Indians know medicine plants white doctors don't know about." Elizabeth considered this. "The doctor might help. He's respected in town." Dakota watched them, wonder evident in his expression. "Why would you do this?" Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. Because in 3 years you've brought more life back to this home than anything else. The admission surprised even her. A moment of silence passed between them, filled with unspoken understanding. If I stay, Dakota finally said, they will search for me. Then we'll convince them you're not who they're looking for, Elizabeth decided. You've done nothing wrong. You're simply a man seeking honest work. James clutched the bear carving tightly. And you're teaching me important stuff, like Pa would have. Dakota's eyes softened at the boy's words. He reached out, his fingertips just brushing the carved bear in James's hand. Little bear speaks wisdom. Sometimes new family forms when old one is lost. In that moment something shifted between them. A recognition that what had begun as a simple employment arrangement had grown into something none of them had anticipated, something worth fighting for. Outside, the cavalry's fire burned low, a reminder that morning would bring hard choices. But for now, in the warm light of Elizabeth's kitchen, 3 wounded souls formed a tentative circle of protection around each other. Morning arrived with the distant call of a meadowlark. Elizabeth had barely slept, her mind turning over possibilities like riverstone. She found herself at the stove earlier than usual, measuring flour for biscuits with practiced hands. Lieutenant Reed and his men appeared as the sun cleared the horizon. Elizabeth met them on the porch, her demeanor composed, despite her racing heart. "Good morning, Lieutenant," she greeted him. "Coffee?" Reed seemed taken aback by the hospitality. "Ma'am, we've come for the Apache." Sheriff Miller rode up then, his timing suspiciously perfect. "Morning, Elizabeth." "Lieutenant." From inside, James appeared. "Ma, Dakota's showing me how to set rabbit snares." Reed's eyebrows lifted as Dakota emerged from behind the house, carrying Thomas's old hunting gear. "You let him handle weapons?" the lieutenant asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "Snares hardly qualify as weapons, Lieutenant," Elizabeth replied calmly, "and Dakota is teaching my son valuable survival skills." Sheriff Miller dismounted, positioning himself subtly between the soldiers and Dakota. "Lieutenant, I've been thinking about your situation. The agent's list, did it specify this man by name?" Reed frowned. "Not exactly. Description matches, though." "Descriptions can be vague," Miller pressed. "And you said yourself the raid happened 2 nights ago. Mrs. Pearson and her son both confirm he was here, and I can attest he's been working here for nearly 3 weeks now," Elizabeth added. "The fence speaks for itself." Reed surveyed the property, noting the newly completed fence line with its carefully crafted post caps. "It's good work," he admitted reluctantly. "It's more than that," Elizabeth said. "It's the work of a man who builds rather than destroys." "Does that sound like your raiders?" The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I have orders to capture dangerous renegades," Sheriff Miller interrupted. "Is this man armed? Has he threatened anyone? Or has he simply sought honest work?" James, emboldened by the adult's advocacy, stepped forward. "He's teaching me things my pa would have taught me if he hadn't died. Important things." Reed's expression softened slightly at the boy's words. After a long moment he sighed. "I need to report to my commanding officer. We'll remain in the area for now," his eyes fixed on Dakota. "Don't go anywhere." After the soldiers departed, Miller turned to Elizabeth. "That bought some time, but they'll be back." "Thank you, Sheriff," Elizabeth said warmly. Miller nodded, his expression troubled. "I'm not sure why I'm helping. By rights he should go back to the reservation. You've seen what he's done here." Elizabeth gestured to the restored fence. "And you've heard about conditions at San Carlos." "I have," Miller acknowledged grimly. "Well, I'd best get back to town. I'll speak with Dr. Peterson. He has some influence with the Indian Affairs Office." After he left, Elizabeth found Dakota by the chicken coop, James hovering nearby. "They'll return," Dakota said simply. "Yes, but we've gained time." Elizabeth touched his arm briefly. "Come inside. I need your help with something." In the kitchen, she retrieved a small wooden box, filled with yellowed recipe cards. She extracted one, its edges soft from handling. "Thomas's favorite apple pie," she explained. "The apples in the orchard are ready. I thought we might make one." Dakota studied the card with its feminine handwriting. "This is important to you," Yes, she admitted. I haven't made it since he died. James peered at the recipe. Pa loved this pie. Said it was better than his mama's, but not to tell her. Elizabeth smiled at the memory. Dakota, would you help us pick the apples? The best ones are on the high branches. The morning transformed as they worked together. Dakota climbed the gnarled apple trees with surprising agility, selecting the ripest fruit while James collected them in a basket. Elizabeth prepared the dough, her hands remembering the motions her mother had taught her. In the warm kitchen, Dakota watched with interest as she demonstrated how to slice the apples thinly and uniformly. Like this, she guided his hands, surprised at her boldness in touching him. His fingers were strong yet gentle with the knife, following her instructions precisely. James sprinkled cinnamon and sugar, his face alight with concentration. Pa always said the secret was extra cinnamon. Your father was right, Elizabeth agreed, her voice catching slightly. As she crimped the edges of the pie crust, she became aware of Dakota watching her hands with quiet appreciation. In my people's way, he said softly, food made with good thoughts nourishes more than body. Elizabeth met his eyes. I believe that too. While the pie baked, filling the house with fragrant memories, they sat on the porch. The completed fence stood like a promise kept, encircling the homestead in newfound security. Will they really let you stay? James asked Dakota, the question that had been hovering unspoken. Dakota considered his answer carefully. Future is never certain, little bear, but this moment is good. Elizabeth watched as her son leaned slightly against Dakota's arm, the gesture so natural it made her heart ache. In 3 short weeks, this quiet man had brought something back to her home that she'd thought lost forever, a sense of wholeness. The scent of apple pie drifted through the open door, blending past and present in a way that no longer felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt strangely like permission to move forward. The cavalry remained camped at the edge of Elizabeth's property for 3 days, a constant reminder of unresolved tension. Lieutenant Reed had ridden to Fort Grant to consult his commanding officer, leaving his men to maintain watch. On the 4th morning, Elizabeth discovered a smooth river stone on her doorstep, marked with a crude red X. She picked it up, turning it over in her palm as unease settled in her stomach. What is it, Ma? James asked, appearing behind her. Elizabeth tucked the stone into her apron pocket. Nothing, sweetheart, just something that blew onto the porch. But later, when James was occupied with his lessons, she showed the stone to Dakota. His expression darkened as he examined it. Warning, he said simply, someone is angry. The soldiers wouldn't leave this, Elizabeth mused. This is from town. Dakota nodded. News travels. They know I am still here. The sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Not military this time. Walt Prescott and 3 other men from town, including Sam Bailey from the general store, his presence surprising Elizabeth. Stay inside, she told Dakota, who nodded reluctantly. Elizabeth met the men in the yard, chin raised. Gentlemen, what brings you out this way? Prescott remained mounted, looking down at her. We've come to talk sense to you, Elizabeth. This has gone on long enough. I wasn't aware my business required town approval, she replied evenly. It becomes town business when you're harboring an Indian who might be connected to raiders, one of the other men said. Thompson's place north of here was hit last week, 2 people dead. Dakota has been here the entire time, Elizabeth countered. Sheriff Miller can confirm that. Miller's sweet on you, Prescott said dismissively, clouds his judgment. The military seems satisfied with my explanation, Elizabeth pointed out. Lieutenant Reed, military's got their hands full with the whole reservation, Prescott interrupted. We're talking about our safety, our families. Sam Bailey finally spoke, his voice apologetic. Elizabeth, folks are scared. There's talk of more raids. Having him here, it don't look right. And what would you have me do? Elizabeth demanded. Turn out a man who's done nothing but honest work, who's helped restore this place when none of you offered a hand after Thomas died. A tense silence followed her words. From the corner of her eye, Elizabeth saw Dakota emerge from the house, standing tall on the porch. The men stiffened, hands moving toward weapons. This is what you're afraid of? Elizabeth asked incredulously. A single man against 4 of you with guns? It ain't just him, Prescott said darkly. It's what he represents, his people. His people, Elizabeth repeated. You mean like his wife and child, who died on that reservation you want to send him back to? Bailey looked uncomfortable. Is that true? Before she could answer, hoofbeats announced another arrival. Dr. Peterson approached, his medical bag bouncing against his saddle. Gentlemen, he greeted them, dismounting smoothly despite his 60 years. Town meeting starting without me. Just having a conversation with Mrs. Pearson about her situation, Prescott replied. The doctor raised an eyebrow. 4 armed men constitutes a conversation these days? Interesting definition. This doesn't concern you, Doc, one of the men muttered. As the only person here who's actually treated patients at San Carlos Reservation, I'd say it very much concerns me. The doctor's usually genial face hardened. That place is a death sentence. Typhoid, malnutrition, tuberculosis, they're dying by the dozens. Prescott shifted in his saddle. That's the government's problem. It becomes our problem when we send a man back to die, Dr. Peterson countered. Especially one who's caused no harm. How do we know that? Prescott demanded. How do we know he won't bring his people down on us? Takoda spoke then, his voice carrying across the yard. If I wished harm, would I build fences, plant gardens? He gestured to the newly tilled soil where he and Elizabeth had started a vegetable garden. Would I teach a fatherless boy to fish and hunt? A heavy silence followed his words. Sam Bailey looked at the ground, shame evident in his posture. We don't want trouble, the storekeeper finally said, but folks are talking. Left this for you. He pulled an envelope from his pocket, extending it to Elizabeth. She recognized the church stationery, a message from Reverend Hollingsworth. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. Whatever that says, Dr. Peterson interjected, I hope it reflects better Christian charity than this visit has. Prescott's jaw tightened. You've been warned, Elizabeth. Town won't stand for this much longer. With that, he wheeled his horse around, the others following reluctantly. After they departed, Elizabeth opened the envelope, reading the brief note within. What does it say? Dr. Peterson asked gently. The Ladies' Aid Society regrets that I am no longer welcome at meetings, Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the pain the words inflicted. And they suggest James might be happier at a school in Tucson, away from corrupting influences. The doctor's face flushed with anger. Despicable. Takoda approached slowly. I bring trouble to your house. Should leave. No, Elizabeth said firmly, crumbling the note. That's exactly what they want. She pulled the marked stone from her pocket, holding it out to Dr. Peterson. This was on my doorstep this morning. The doctor examined it grimly. Intimidation. Coward's tactic. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, a calm resolve settling over her. Well, they'll find I'm not easily intimidated. This is my home, and I decide who's welcome here. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, stacking like angry fists against the sky. Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching as the afternoon light turned an eerie yellow-green. The air hung heavy and still, pregnant with the promise of violence. Storm coming, Takoda observed, joining her. A week had passed since the confrontation with the townsmen, a week of wary peace. Lieutenant Reed had returned briefly to inform them that his commanding officer was consulting with Indian Affairs regarding Takoda's status. A big one from the look of it, Elizabeth agreed. We should secure everything. They worked with practiced efficiency, their movements falling into natural synchronization after weeks of shared labor. James helped gather the chickens into their reinforced coop, while Elizabeth and Takoda moved tools and loose items into the barn. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley like artillery fire. Wind began to pick up, bending the tall grass in waves. Reminds me of the storm that took our roof 2 years back, James said, his voice tinged with memory. Pat and I spent all night holding tarps down. Elizabeth remembered that night, Thomas soaked to the skin, laughing despite the destruction, teaching James that nature must sometimes be endured rather than conquered. Your fence will hold, Takoda assured her, his hand briefly touching the small of her back as they hurried toward the house. The casual contact sent warmth through her, despite the dropping temperature. Inside, Elizabeth retrieved the old storm lantern from its shelf. The glass was cracked on one side, damaged during the last big storm, but Thomas had wrapped copper wire around it as a temporary fix that had become permanent. James, help me fill this, she instructed. If the storm knocks out the windows, we'll need light. The boy carefully poured kerosene into the lantern, while Elizabeth gathered blankets and candles. Takoda watched their preparations with approval. Your people prepare well, he commented. Apache do the same, respect storm's power. The first fat droplets of rain hit the roof as Elizabeth lit the lantern, its light casting strange shadows through the cracked glass. Outside, the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that raised the hair on her arms. We should move to the root cellar if it gets worse, she said, peering through the window at the darkening sky. There's a storm door on the north side of the house. Dakota nodded. I will check the animals once more. Before she could protest, he slipped out the back door into the intensifying storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard in harsh white light. In that frozen moment, Elizabeth saw the massive oak at the edge of the property, its branches thrashing against the onslaught. "Ma," James called from the other room, the front windows leaking. Elizabeth hurried to help her son place a bucket under the dripping sill. Water pattered against the tin with a rhythmic ping that barely registered beneath the storm's growing fury. "Where's Dakota?" James asked, worry creasing his young brow. "Checking on the animals," Elizabeth replied, straining to see through the rain-lashed windows. "He'll be back soon." Another lightning strike, closer this time, followed almost immediately by a thunderclap that shook the house to its foundations. James pressed against her side, and she wrapped her arm around his shoulders. "It's all right," she soothed, though her own heart raced. "The house has weathered worse." The back door burst open, Dakota appearing like a spirit from the deluge, water streaming from his clothes. "Animals secure," he reported. "Storm is—" His words were cut short by a sound like the world splitting apart, a tremendous crack followed by a groaning, tearing noise that Elizabeth felt in her bones. The old oak. "Get down," Dakota shouted, lunging toward them as the massive tree toppled toward the house. The impact shook the structure, wood splintering as a large branch punched through the roof near the kitchen. Rain immediately began pouring through the opening. "The cellar," Elizabeth gasped. "Now." Dakota grabbed the lantern while Elizabeth pulled James toward the door. They stumbled into the howling darkness, rain pelting them like pebbles as they made their way to the storm cellar entrance. The wooden doors flapped violently against their restraints. Dakota wrenched them open, ushering Elizabeth and James down the earthy steps before securing the doors behind them. In the lantern's fractured light, the root cellar appeared as a sanctuary of earth and stone. Shelves lined with preserves stood against one wall, while sacks of potatoes and onions rested against another. The space was small but dry, the packed dirt floor surprisingly warm compared to the chaos above. "Are you hurt?" Dakota asked, inspecting them both with concerned eyes. "We're fine," Elizabeth assured him, wringing water from her skirt. "Thanks to your warning." James huddled on a wooden crate, shivering slightly. Dakota removed his outer shirt, still somewhat dry on the inside, and draped it around the boy's shoulders. Thanks," James stammered, pulling the garment tighter around himself. Elizabeth set the lantern on a barrel. Its damaged glass threw strange, beautiful patterns across the walls, stars and crescents born of imperfection. "Looks like we'll be here a while," she observed as the storm continued its assault above them. The cellar remained solid and secure, a pocket of calm amid the tempest. Dakota settled beside them, his presence reassuring in the close quarters. "I will tell story," he offered, "Apache way to pass storm time, story of Coyote and the wind." As his rich voice filled the small space, Elizabeth found herself leaning slightly against his shoulder, drawn to his warmth. James's eyes grew heavy despite the storm's percussion, the boy gradually slumping against Dakota's other side. The cracked lantern burned steadily, its imperfect light somehow more beautiful than perfect illumination would have been. In its glow, three people from different worlds found unexpected shelter in each other. Dawn broke clear and brilliant after the storm, the world washed clean of dust and tension. Elizabeth emerged from the root cellar, blinking in the harsh light of morning. The oak tree lay across her yard like a fallen giant, one massive branch impaled through her kitchen roof. "Could have been worse," she murmured, surveying the damage. Dakota stood beside her, his expression grim. "Tree can be moved, roof fixed." James scrambled up onto the trunk, already seeing adventure where adults saw only destruction. "It's like a bridge now. A bridge we need to remove," Elizabeth called. "Carefully, James." They spent the morning assessing damage and beginning repairs. Dakota climbed onto the roof with surprising agility, examining the puncture wound in the shingles. "Need new boards," he called down, "and tar paper." Elizabeth nodded. "I'll have to go to town." "I'll come with you," James offered quickly. "No," she replied firmly. I need you and Dakota to start clearing the smaller branches. The truth was, she wasn't ready to face the town's judgment alone, but she wouldn't risk exposing her son to it either. As she prepared the wagon, Dakota approached. Be careful, he said simply, but his eyes conveyed deeper concern. I'll be fine, she assured him. It's still early, the general store should be quiet. The journey to town revealed the storm's path, fences down, trees uprooted, a windmill collapsed at the Pearson farm. Elizabeth felt a small measure of gratitude that her property had fared relatively well, thanks in part to the fence Dakota had built to withstand precisely such forces. Copper Springs appeared subdued, residents busy with their own repairs. At the general store, Sam Bailey looked up in surprise as she entered. Elizabeth, he greeted her awkwardly. Heard you lost your oak tree. News travels fast, she remarked dryly. Prescott rode by your place this morning, Bailey admitted. Said the tree hit your house. Elizabeth nodded. Through the kitchen roof. I need boards and tar paper. Bailey gathered her supplies without comment, though she felt his gaze on her repeatedly. Finally he sighed. Look, Elizabeth, about the other day. You were doing what you thought was right, she interrupted. As am I. The storekeeper looked troubled. It's just, there's been more raids north of here. People are scared, and they need someone to blame, Elizabeth finished for him. Well, it isn't Dakota. He was with us in the storm cellar all night. Bailey added the purchases to her account without further comment, though his expression remained conflicted. The return journey felt longer, the wagon heavy with supplies and unspoken tensions. As she approached her property, Elizabeth saw Dakota and James working together to clear branches, their movements in natural harmony. Her heart tightened unexpectedly at the sight. James needed this, a man's guidance, someone to teach him the things Thomas would have. And Dakota seemed to understand the boy in ways Elizabeth couldn't. For all her love and effort, they unloaded the supplies quickly. Dakota began sorting boards while Elizabeth prepared a late lunch from their storm-depleted pantry. As she worked, she noticed Dakota gathering his few possessions from the corner of the barn where he'd been sleeping. What are you doing? She asked, setting down her basket. Moving to house, he replied. Sleep on kitchen floor until roof fixed. Not safe for you and James with hole in house. The suggestion made practical sense, yet Elizabeth felt a flutter of something like panic. Having Dakota sleep under their roof crossed an invisible boundary, one the town would certainly notice. Before she could respond, James called from the barn. Ma, look what I found in the fallen hay. They followed his voice to find him holding a small leather satchel, sodden from the rain but intact. Elizabeth recognized it immediately, her heart skipping. That was your father's, she said softly, his travel pack. I thought it was lost. Must have been in the loft, James said, opening the drawstring. There's stuff inside. Elizabeth knelt beside him as he pulled out the contents, a small notebook, a compass, a folding knife and a tightly folded piece of leather. James carefully unfolded the leather to reveal a hand-drawn map. The ink faded but still legible. Past trading route, James whispered reverently. Elizabeth traced the familiar lines with her fingertip. Thomas had traveled north several times yearly, trading with ranchers and occasionally with the Apache before the reservation system had changed everything. As she studied the map, she became aware of Dakota's stillness beside her. Looking up, she found him staring at the map with an unreadable expression. What is it? She asked. His finger pointed to a small X marked in the northern corner. This place, I know it. That's where Thomas would meet the Apache traders, Elizabeth explained. He called it Cottonwood Spring. Dakota's eyes met hers, something like wonder and pain mingling in their depths. 3 winters ago, a white man, caught in snowstorm. Elizabeth's breath caught. What? I found him there, Dakota continued, his voice low and steady, at Cottonwood Spring. He was lost, cold. I tried to help him to my camp. No, Elizabeth whispered, understanding dawning like a physical pain. That's not possible. Dakota reached slowly into his shirt, withdrawing a small object that caught the light. A silver pocket watch. He gave me this, Dakota said softly. Said his name was Thomas Pearson. Elizabeth stared at the silver pocket watch in Dakota's palm, its familiar engravings catching the afternoon light. Thomas's initials adorned the back, the small dent on the rim exactly where she remembered it, a wedding gift from her father to her husband, passed down through generations. How? The word escaped her like a prayer. How did you get this? James looked between them, confusion giving way to understanding. You knew my pa. Dakota nodded solemnly. Yes, little bear. I was with him when he walked to the ancestors. Elizabeth's knees weakened. She sank onto a hay bale, her mind racing through implications. You've known who we were all along. Yes, Dakota admitted. When I escaped reservation, I remembered his words. Searched for Pearson homestead. What words? Elizabeth whispered. What did he say to you? Dakota reached into his shirt again, this time withdrawing a small buckskin pouch worn smooth by constant handling. From it, he carefully extracted a folded scrap of paper, yellowed and fragile. His writing, Dakota explained, gently unfolding it, could not read words but kept safe. Elizabeth took the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting, unmistakably Thomas's, was faint but legible. Tell Lizzie and James I love them. Take care of them if you can. A small sound escaped her throat, not quite a cry, more primal than that. 3 years of wondering about her husband's final moments, imagining him alone and cold, crashed down around her. You were with him, she whispered. He wasn't alone. James pressed against her side, his small fingers tracing his father's handwriting. What happened? He asked Dakota. How did you find him? Dakota sat cross-legged on the barn floor, his movements deliberate as he gathered his thoughts. Heavy snow that winter. Unusual. I was hunting near Cottonwood Spring when storm came suddenly. Found shelter in rock overhang. As night fell, saw something moving in snow. Your father, lost from trail. Elizabeth closed her eyes, visualizing the scene. Thomas had been returning from his northern trading route when a freak snowstorm struck. The territory's weather was notoriously unpredictable in late autumn. He was already cold, Dakota continued. Fingers blue. I brought him to my shelter, built fire, but the cold, it was too deep in him. Hypothermia, Elizabeth murmured. They had told her pneumonia, but perhaps it had started as exposure. Dakota nodded. He spoke of you both. Many stories. The boy who could catch fish with bare hands. He smiled gently at James, the wife who made apple pies like medicine for the soul. Tears spilled down Elizabeth's cheeks, but they weren't entirely of sorrow. There was comfort in knowing Thomas's final thoughts had been of them, that he had shared their stories even as his life ebbed away. He gave me watch, Dakota explained. Said, tell them I tried to come home, then wrote these words. He gestured to the paper in Elizabeth's hands. Grew weaker through night. By morning his spirit had departed. I buried him with respect, in Apache way and with prayer to his God. The authorities said they found him near Thompson's Creek, Elizabeth said, confusion furrowing her brow. I carried him there after storm passed, Dakota explained. Knew white men would not understand Apache helping white trader, would blame me for his death. The realization struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. You risked yourself to ensure he was found and returned to us. Dakota inclined his head slightly. It was right thing, but could not deliver message then. Reservation guards caught me returning. Punishment was severe for leaving without permission. But you remembered us, James said softly. All this time. I remembered, Dakota confirmed. When my family died on reservation, I remembered promise to man who spoke kindly of wife and son, who shared last jerky with stranger who helped him. Elizabeth looked down at the small buckskin pouch still in Dakota's hand. What else do you carry there? Dakota opened it, revealing 3 small portions of soil separated by thin leather dividers. Earth from where Thomas returned to earth. Earth from graves of my wife and daughter. And he hesitated. Earth from this place, taken first day I arrived. 3 worlds connected. The simple spirituality of the gesture moved Elizabeth deeply. This man, whom the town viewed with suspicion and fear, had honored her husband and kept a promise across years of hardship. Had sought them out, not to seek reward, but to fulfill a dying man's request. That's why you came here, she said, understanding dawning, not just for work or escape. To keep promise, Dakota acknowledged. Did not know how you would receive Apache stranger, so I came as worker first, to observe if you needed help before speaking truth. James touched the watch in Dakota's hand. Past would have wanted you to have this. Dakota shook his head gently. Belongs to son now. As the watch passed from Dakota's hand to James's, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, a closing of one circle and the opening of another. The mysterious connection she'd felt with Dakota from the beginning suddenly made sense. He had been the last to speak with Thomas, to hear his voice, to receive his love for his family. Thank you, she whispered, for being with him, for bringing his words home. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through clouds, casting long shadows through the barn door. In the distance, the damaged house awaited repair. But here, in this moment, something else was being mended, something far more essential than roof beams and shingles. Word spread through Copper Springs like wildfire. A town meeting had been called to address the Indian situation. The bell in the small town hall rang out at dusk, its solemn tone carrying across the valley to Elizabeth's homestead. "You shouldn't go," Dakota advised as she pinned her hair. 2 days had passed since his revelation about Thomas, days spent in a strange new understanding. They had worked side by side repairing the roof, their conversations deeper now, unburdened by secrets. "I have to," Elizabeth replied, securing her mother's silver comb. "If I don't speak for you, who will?" James looked up from Thomas's pocket watch, which he'd taken to carrying everywhere. "I want to come too." "No, sweetheart. You'll stay here with Dakota." Her tone brooked no argument. Sheriff Miller arrived to escort her, his expression troubled. "It's getting ugly, Elizabeth. Prescott's been stirring folks up all day." "Then it's even more important that I'm there," she said, climbing into his wagon. As they approached town, Elizabeth could see lanterns illuminating the town hall, shadows moving behind frosted windows. The murmur of voices fell silent as she entered, all eyes turning toward her. Reverend Hollingsworth stood at the front, his thin face solemn beneath silver hair. Beside him sat his wife, Walt Prescott, and 3 other prominent citizens, forming an impromptu committee. The room was packed with townsfolk, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. "Mrs. Pearson," the Reverend acknowledged, "we're discussing the situation with the Apache currently residing on your property." "His name is Dakota," Elizabeth said clearly, taking a seat in the front row, "and he has done nothing to warrant this tribunal." Walt Prescott leaned forward. "With all due respect, Elizabeth, this ain't about just one Indian. It's about the safety of our community. 3 more homesteads north of here were raided last week." "By Dakota?" Elizabeth challenged. "Who was helping repair my roof after the storm? Who has been seen by multiple witnesses working on my property for nearly a month?" "We're not saying he personally attacked those homesteads," Mrs. Hollingsworth interjected, her voice dripping with forced sympathy. "But his presence here sends a message to others of his kind, that they're welcome." "His kind?" Dr. Peterson's voice cut through the murmurs. The doctor stood from his seat at the back. "You mean human beings trying to survive the reservation conditions our government has imposed?" "Now, Doc," Prescott began, but Peterson continued. "I've treated patients at San Carlos. The conditions are deplorable. Starvation, disease, inadequate shelter. Is it any wonder some try to escape? The reservation system exists for a reason," Reverend Hollingsworth stated firmly, "for the protection of all." Protection. Elizabeth couldn't contain herself. Dakota lost his wife and child on that reservation, to fevers that could have been prevented with proper medical care, with enough food. An uncomfortable silence followed her words. Sam Bailey cleared his throat. "That may be true, Elizabeth, but it doesn't change the fact that folks are scared." "They're scared because of ignorance," Elizabeth replied, "because they don't know him as I do." "And how exactly do you know him, Mrs. Pearson?" Mrs. Hollingsworth asked, her implication clear in her tone. Elizabeth straightened in her seat. The moment had come to share what she had learned, though she had debated whether to reveal this connection. "Dakota was with my husband when he died," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent room. 3 years ago, when Thomas was caught in that freak snowstorm, Dakota found him and tried to save him. He sheltered him, built a fire, and stayed with him through his final hours." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "That's convenient," Prescott scoffed. "How would you know that's true?" Elizabeth reached into her pocket, withdrawing the yellowed paper with Thomas's final message. "Because Thomas wrote this before he died. Dakota has kept it safe all these years, along with my husband's pocket watch, which he returned to James." Sheriff Miller took the paper and passed it to the committee. Reverend Hollingsworth examined it closely, his expression troubled. "This appears to be Thomas's handwriting," he admitted reluctantly. "Dakota carried Thomas's body through the snow to where it would be found," Elizabeth continued. "He did this knowing he would be severely punished for leaving the reservation. He did it to honor my husband's final wishes." "If this is true," Sam Bailey asked, "why didn't he tell you this when he first arrived?" "He wasn't sure how I would receive an Apache stranger," Elizabeth explained. "So he came seeking honest work first, to observe whether we needed help before revealing his connection to Thomas." Dr. Peterson moved to stand beside Elizabeth. I believe Mrs. Pearson's account, and I believe this committee should consider what Thomas Pearson would want for his family. The mention of Thomas, a respected member of the community before his death, created a thoughtful pause. Even Walt Prescott seemed momentarily at a loss. Mrs. Hollingsworth recovered first. While this is touching, it doesn't change the fact that he's an unauthorized Indian off the reservation. We have procedures, laws made by men who've never set foot on a reservation, Dr. Peterson countered, who've never seen children dying of preventable diseases. Elizabeth scanned the faces in the room, seeking any sign of sympathy. Some avoided her gaze, but others, including Sam Bailey, appeared genuinely conflicted. I move that we petition the cavalry to remove the Apache to San Carlos, as regulations require, Prescott finally stated. The vote was quick and decisive. Despite Elizabeth's testimony and Dr. Peterson's support, the committee voted 4-1 to request military intervention. Only the doctor's wife, who served as town schoolteacher, voted against. As the meeting dispersed, Sheriff Miller approached Elizabeth. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'll stall as long as I can, but they'll send for Lieutenant Reed." Elizabeth nodded, her back straight despite the defeat. "Thank you, Sheriff." The town hall bell tolled once more as she exited into the night, a single resonant note that seemed to mark the end of something. But as she climbed into Miller's wagon for the ride home, Elizabeth felt not despair, but a strange, fierce resolve. They had not yet heard the end of this story. Not by far. The cavalry arrived 3 days later, dust announcing their approach long before the riders came into view. Elizabeth had been expecting them, had prepared what she would say, yet her heart still raced as Lieutenant Reed dismounted in her yard. "Mrs. Pearson," he greeted her, removing his hat. His young face looked troubled beneath military composure. "I've received formal notification from the town committee regarding your guest." "I assumed as much," Elizabeth replied, standing firmly on her porch. Inside, James watched from the window while Dakota continued his work in the newly repaired kitchen. His presence a deliberate statement. Reed produced an official document from his saddlebag. "I have orders to escort all unauthorized Apache back to the San Carlos reservation immediately." "Lieutenant," Elizabeth began, "there are circumstances you should be aware of." "I've been briefed about your husband's connection," Reed interrupted gently. Sheriff Miller explained. "I'm sympathetic, Mrs. Pearson, truly, but my orders are clear." "Then you understand Dakota isn't just some unauthorized Apache. He tried to save my husband's life. He honored Thomas's final wishes by coming here." Reed's expression softened slightly. "I understand, but the law doesn't make exceptions for good intentions. The reservation system exists to prevent exactly the kind of raids we've been seeing." "Raids Dakota had nothing to do with," Elizabeth countered. "Perhaps not," Reed conceded, "but every Indian off the reservation encourages others to leave. It undermines the entire system." Elizabeth felt a flash of anger. "A system that's killing them through neglect and starvation." Reed looked genuinely conflicted. "That's not my department, ma'am. I'm just a lieutenant following orders." The door opened behind Elizabeth, and Dakota stepped onto the porch. He stood tall, his dignity palpable as he faced the young officer. "I will speak," he said calmly. Reed's hand instinctively moved toward his holster before settling at his side. "Go ahead." "I left reservation when nothing remained for me there," Dakota stated simply. "My wife, my daughter, both in ground. No food, no hope. Many die slow death there. I'm sorry for your loss," Reed replied, surprising Elizabeth with his sincerity. "But I have my orders." "You have choice," Dakota countered. "All men have choice between what is ordered and what is right." A muscle twitched in Reed's jaw. "I have 48 hours before I must report back with all unauthorized Apache in the area. That's all the choice I have." James suddenly burst from the house. "You can't take him. He's family now." Elizabeth reached for her son, but he dodged her grasp, planting himself beside Dakota. "He teaches me things, important things, things Pa would have taught me." Reed looked genuinely pained at the boy's outburst. "Son, I understand you've grown attached, but you don't understand anything," James shouted, tears welling in his eyes. "You just want to send him back to die like his wife and little girl did." "James," Elizabeth chided gently, though her heart swelled with pride at his passionate defense. Reed glanced between them, then sighed heavily. 48 hours, Mrs. Pearson. I suggest you use that time to say your goodbyes." With that, he replaced his hat and returned to his horse. As the cavalry departed, Elizabeth felt a strange calm settle over her. Not resignation, but determination. "You heard him," she said quietly. "We have 48 hours. To do what?" James asked, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "To find another way," she replied. Inside, they gathered around the kitchen table. Takoda remained standing, his expression unreadable. "I should go," he said finally. "Bring no more trouble to you." "Absolutely not," Elizabeth stated firmly. "The reservation is a death sentence. We all know it. What choice is there?" Takoda asked pragmatically. "They will search. Find me eventually." Elizabeth paced the kitchen, mind racing. "Dr. Peterson has contacts in Santa Fe. Perhaps he could arrange passage further north. Or Mexico," James suggested. "Pa said the border patrols are spread thin." Elizabeth paused, surprised by her son's strategic thinking. "That's actually worth considering." Takoda watched them, bewilderment crossing his features. "Why would you risk this? For me?" Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "You know why." A moment of silence stretched between them, laden with unspoken feelings that had grown through weeks of shared work, meals, and now shared purpose. "More cares about you," James stated with a child's directness. "And so do I." Takoda's expression softened. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something, a slender braided band of horsehair, intricate patterns woven through its length. "Made this," he said quietly, offering it to Elizabeth. "Apache way. When paths join, we mark connection." Elizabeth accepted the bracelet, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "It's beautiful. In my tradition," Takoda explained, "when one saves another's life, they become responsible for each other. Your husband's spirit guided me here. Now our paths are one." Elizabeth slipped the braided band onto her wrist, feeling the weight of his words. "Then we'll find a way to keep them together." "How?" James asked practically. Elizabeth squared her shoulders. "First, we speak with Dr. Peterson. Then Sheriff Miller. We need allies." As evening approached, Elizabeth watched Takoda and James from the kitchen window. They sat together on the porch steps, Takoda demonstrating how to craft a small wooden whistle. The boy's attention was absolute, his hands following Takoda's patient guidance. The scene crystallized her resolve. This wasn't just about honoring Thomas's final wish anymore. This was about the family they were becoming. Unexpected, unconventional, but no less real for its unusual formation. Her fingers traced the braided horsehair at her wrist, paths joining, lives intertwining. She would not let Reed or the town committee sever that connection. Not when it had been formed through loss, strengthened through work, and now bound with something that felt remarkably like love. Dawn of the final day broke with a copper hue that seemed fitting for what Elizabeth had come to think of as their last stand. She had spent the previous day in hushed consultation with Dr. Peterson, who promised to arrive early with what support he could muster. Sheriff Miller had visited at dusk, his expression grave. "Prescott's gathered some men," he'd warned. "They're talking about coming out here before Reed returns, taking matters into their own hands." "Vigilantes," Elizabeth had said flatly. Miller nodded. "I can't stop them officially, not until they actually break the law, but I can be here, make my presence known." Now, as morning light spilled across the yard, Elizabeth watched Takoda from the kitchen window. He sat on the porch steps, his hands moving methodically over a piece of wood. A half-finished horse emerged from the pine, its lines graceful despite its incomplete state. James appeared beside her. "Is today when they come for him?" "Yes," Elizabeth answered honestly, "but we have a plan." After breakfast, Dr. Peterson arrived as promised, accompanied by his wife and, surprisingly, Sam Bailey from the general store. "Didn't expect to see you here, Sam," Elizabeth remarked as they gathered in her parlor. The storekeeper looked uncomfortable but determined. "Didn't feel right. What the committee decided. Thomas was my friend. If he trusted this man enough to carry his final words home." He shrugged. "Seems I should at least hear him out." Takoda joined them, the half-finished wooden horse in his hands. He presented it to James. "May not have time to finish. You can complete it." The boy took the carving, his fingers tracing the smooth curves. "I'll keep it till you come back to finish it yourself," he said stubbornly. Dr. Peterson cleared his throat. "I've spoken with Judge Harrison in Tucson." He's willing to consider a special dispensation given the circumstances with Thomas, but Takoda would need to appear before him personally. Tucson is 3 days' ride, Elizabeth said. We'd never make it before Reed returns. I've also contacted my colleague at the Indian Affairs Bureau, the doctor continued. The regulations do allow for exceptions in certain cases of service to white settlers. Thomas's final letter might qualify, but the conversation halted at the sound of approaching horses, not the disciplined cadence of cavalry, but the irregular rhythm of multiple riders approaching too quickly. Sheriff Miller stepped onto the porch, hand resting on his holster. Prescott, he confirmed grimly, and at least 6 others. Elizabeth's heart raced as she retrieved Thomas's rifle from above the mantel. She checked it was loaded with steady hands that belied her inner turmoil. "You can't shoot your neighbors, Elizabeth," Dr. Pearson cautioned. "I won't," she replied calmly, "but they need to understand I'm prepared to protect my home." She stepped onto the porch beside Sheriff Miller, rifle held firmly but pointed downward. Takoda positioned himself slightly behind her, a deliberate choice that she understood. He would not appear threatening, yet neither would he hide. Walt Prescott led the group, reining his horse to a stop in her yard. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the rifle in Elizabeth's hands. "This isn't necessary, Elizabeth," he called. "We've come to take the Indian to the fort, save the army the trouble. He has a name," Elizabeth replied evenly, "and he's under my protection." "Protection?" one of the other men scoffed. "Have you gone completely native, woman?" Sheriff Miller stepped forward. "That's enough. This is still Mrs. Pearson's property, and you have no legal authority here." "We have the authority of concerned citizens," Prescott countered. "The committee voted. He goes back to the reservation." "The committee doesn't speak for me." Sam Bailey's voice came from behind Elizabeth as he stepped onto the porch. Several of the riders shifted uncomfortably at the sight of the respected storekeeper standing with Elizabeth. "Sam," Prescott's surprise was evident. "What are you doing here?" "Remembering what it means to be a Christian," Bailey replied firmly, "and a friend to Thomas Pearson's family." A murmur passed through the men on horseback. Prescott's jaw tightened. "This isn't about Thomas. It's about safety, about law." "Is it?" Dr. Pearson emerged, his wife beside him. "Or is it about fear of what's different? This man," he gestured to Takoda, "tried to save Thomas Pearson's life, carried his body through snow to ensure he was returned to his family, kept his final message safe for 3 years before delivering it personally." "Convenient story," Prescott muttered, though with less conviction. James suddenly pushed past the adults, the half-finished wooden horse clutched in his hand. "My pa trusted him," he shouted up at Prescott. "Why can't you?" Elizabeth moved to pull her son back, but Takoda's gentle hand on her arm stopped her. He stepped forward, unarmed, his posture non-threatening, yet dignified. "I understand your fear," he addressed Prescott directly. "When strangers come, we fear for family, for home." He gestured to the homestead around them. "I came here to honor dying man's wish, found people who judge by actions, not birth, found new home." The simple sincerity of his words created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Even Prescott seemed at a loss for an immediate retort. The tension was broken by the distant sound of approaching riders, the rhythmic hoofbeats of military mounts. Lieutenant Reed had returned earlier than expected. "Well," Prescott said with grim satisfaction, "appears the army will settle this after all." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Sheriff Miller, who nodded slightly. Whatever happened next, the confrontation had evolved beyond their control. Reed would make his decision, and they would face the consequences together. As the cavalry crested the hill, Elizabeth felt Takoda's hand briefly touch hers, their fingers intertwining for a moment before separating. The half-finished wooden horse in James's grip seemed suddenly poignant, a symbol of all that might remain incomplete if they failed. Lieutenant Reed dismounted with fluid efficiency, taking in the tense tableau before him. Elizabeth with her rifle, Sheriff Miller at her side, the vigilantes on horseback, and the small group gathered protectively around Takoda. "This is quite the welcome committee," he remarked dryly. "Mr. Prescott, I don't recall requesting civilian assistance." Prescott shifted uncomfortably. "Just ensuring the job gets done, Lieutenant." "The job, as you put it, is military business," Reed replied coolly. "I suggest you and your men return to town." Something in the young officer's tone brooked no argument. Prescott hesitated, then nodded reluctantly to his companions. The lieutenant has it handled, he conceded, though his expression remained sour as they turned their horses toward town. As they departed, Reed turned to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Pearson, I've returned for the Apache as ordered." Elizabeth's grip tightened on her rifle. "Lieutenant." "If I may speak," Dr. Peterson interrupted, stepping forward. He carried a worn leather satchel that Elizabeth recognized as his medical bag, though it looked different from his usual one, older military issue. Reed nodded respectfully. "Dr. Peterson." "Lieutenant, before you proceed, there's something you should know." The doctor opened his satchel, removing a folded document. "I served as a military physician at Fort Grant before settling here. I treated soldiers and Apache alike." Reed accepted the document, military discharge papers confirming the doctor's service. "I'm aware of your background, doctor, but then you should be aware of what I witnessed at San Carlos," Peterson continued firmly. He reached back into his bag, extracting a small buckskin pouch similar to Dakota's. "This was given to me by an Apache medicine man after I treated his grandson for pneumonia. Inside are herbs that saved at least 30 soldiers during an outbreak when our Western medicines failed." Reed looked skeptical but attentive. "What's your point, doctor?" "My point is that there's wisdom and humanity on both sides of this conflict. I've documented the conditions at San Carlos extensively." He produced a journal from his satchel. "Starvation rations, contaminated water, inadequate shelter. In the 3 months I treated patients there, I recorded 117 deaths, 42 of them children." The stark numbers hung in the air. Reed's expression remained impassive, though Elizabeth detected a flicker of discomfort. "Those are unfortunate statistics, doctor, but they don't change my orders." "Perhaps this will." Sam Bailey stepped forward, surprising everyone. "I've brought the town's trading records." He held up a leather-bound ledger. "Thomas Pearson traded fairly with the Apache for years before the reservation system. His records show he considered Dakota's band peaceful and trustworthy, called them the most honorable business partners a man could ask for." Reed glanced between them. "Gentlemen, while I appreciate," Lieutenant Sheriff Miller interrupted, "I've known you since you were stationed here. You're a fair man. Before you make your decision, you should hear all the facts." Something in Miller's tone gave Reed pause. He sighed, removing his hat. "Very well, I'm listening." Elizabeth seized the opportunity. "Dakota has rebuilt our lives, Lieutenant. Not just the fence or the roof, but our sense of family. My son has flourished under his guidance." As if on cue, James stepped forward, clutching Thomas's final message and the half-finished wooden horse. "My pa's last wish was for Dakota to look after us," he said, his young voice steady with conviction. "He's doing what Pa wanted." Reed examined the paper, his brow furrowed. "This appears authentic." "It is," Elizabeth confirmed, "as is this." She extended her wrist, showing the braided horsehair bracelet. "In Apache tradition, when someone saves a life, as Dakota tried to save my husband's, they become responsible for that person's family. He came here not just seeking work, but fulfilling a sacred obligation." Reed looked to Dakota, who had remained silent throughout. "Is this true?" Dakota nodded once. "Thomas Pearson showed kindness when many would not. His last words were of his family. I promised to deliver his message, to see they were safe." He gestured to the repaired homestead around them. "I build, I protect, I honor my word." A tense silence followed as Reed considered everything he'd heard. His gaze traveled from the homestead's mended fence to the half-finished wooden horse in James's hands, to the faces of those gathered in support. "Lieutenant," Dr. Peterson said quietly, "there are legal provisions for Indians who provide exceptional service to white settlers. Thomas's letter, combined with Dakota's ongoing support of this family, could qualify. I've already contacted Indian Affairs." Reed paced a few steps, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he turned to his men. "Sergeant, make note in your report that we found no unauthorized Apache matching the description of the reservation escapees." The sergeant looked confused. "Sir." "Clearly," Reed continued deliberately, "this man doesn't match our description. The raiders were reported to be young braves, not," he gestured vaguely at Dakota, "a family man with carpentry skills." Elizabeth could scarcely believe what she was hearing. The lieutenant was creating a fiction that would allow Dakota to remain. "But sir," one soldier began, "the committee specifically." "The committee," Reed interrupted firmly, "is not in my chain of command. My orders were to apprehend Apache raiders and escapees who pose a threat to settlers. I see no such threat here." He turned to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Pearson, Dr. Peterson will help you file the necessary paperwork with Indian Affairs. Until then, I trust you'll ensure your employee remains on your property." "Of course, Lieutenant," Elizabeth agreed, hardly daring to breathe. Reed replaced his hat, offering a crisp nod. "Then our business here is concluded." As the cavalry departed, Elizabeth felt her knees weaken with relief. James whooped with joy, throwing his arms around Takoda, who stood in stunned silence. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. "Truly." Sheriff Miller clapped him on the shoulder. "Not entirely. There'll be paperwork, hearings probably. But yes, the immediate danger has passed." Dr. Peterson closed his medicine bag with a satisfied smile. "Lieutenant Reed is a better man than I gave him credit for." He found a way to follow both his orders and his conscience. Elizabeth gazed out at her property, the mended fence, the repaired roof, the newly planted garden, all created by their hands working together. Then she looked at Takoda, standing tall in the afternoon sun, James still clinging to his side. "We've won this battle," she said softly. "Now we begin building what comes next." Spring came to Copper Springs with gentle insistence, painting the desert with wild flowers and promise. 6 months had passed since Lieutenant Reed had ridden away, leaving Takoda standing tall in Elizabeth's yard. 6 months of gradual change, both on the homestead and in the town itself. The paperwork Dr. Peterson had mentioned proved challenging but not insurmountable. A special dispensation had been granted by Indian Affairs, recognizing Takoda's extraordinary service to the Pearson family and Thomas's final request. The document, framed and hanging in the parlor, represented more than legal protection. It was acknowledgement of belonging. Elizabeth stood in her garden, now expanded to twice its original size, watching as tender shoots pushed through the soil. Nearby, James and Takoda worked on the corral, their movements synchronized after months of shared labor. The boy had grown taller, his shoulders broadening as he approached his 13th birthday. "Ma," James called, waving her over. Takoda finished it. She approached the newly constructed gate between the garden and corral. Takoda stepped back, a rare smile softening his features as she examined his handiwork. The gate latch was a work of art, carved mesquite wood shaped into an elegant mechanism that secured the gate while featuring intertwined initials, EP and T. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Strong wood," Takoda explained, "survives desert, bends but doesn't break." His eyes met hers. "Like you." Their relationship had evolved gradually, respectfully. Shared meals became shared confidences. Work partnerships became deeper bonds. The horsehair bracelet remained on Elizabeth's wrist, joined now by a simple silver band Takoda had crafted from a coin. Not a formal marriage that would have required permissions the territory wasn't ready to grant, but a commitment recognized by those who mattered most. Dr. Peterson had performed a small ceremony beside the fence where they had first met, combining elements of both their traditions. "Sheriff's coming," James announced, shading his eyes against the sun. John Miller rode up, looking more relaxed than Elizabeth had seen him in years. The tensions of the previous autumn had gradually dissipated, thanks in part to his patient diplomacy in town. "Beautiful day," he called, dismounting. "Garden's looking fine, Elizabeth. We have you to thank for being able to plant it at all," she replied warmly. Miller shrugged modestly. "Just did what was right." He nodded to Takoda. "Town council meeting went well. Voted to formally rescind last year's petition." This was significant news. The council, with several new members including Sam Bailey, had officially reversed their stance on Takoda's presence. "Any trouble?" Takoda asked. Prescott grumbled, but he was outvoted, Miller replied. "Having Mrs. Hollingsworth on your side made the difference." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow in surprise. The minister's wife had been among their staunchest opponents initially. "Her change of heart came after you fixed the church roof," Miller explained with a smile. "Said any man who'd volunteer to repair the Lord's house deserved Christian charity in return." They shared a quiet laugh at this practical conversion. Takoda had spent the winter making himself useful around town, repairing, building, quietly demonstrating his character through actions rather than words. "There's more," Miller continued. "Reverend Hollingsworth asked if you'll all attend service on Sunday. Says the congregation should hear Thomas's full story." Elizabeth glanced at Takoda, who nodded. "We'll be there." After Miller departed, they sat together on the porch as evening approached. James practiced with the wooden flute Dakota had carved for him, the notes floating across the property. "Did you ever imagine this?" Elizabeth asked softly. "When you first stood at our gate?" Dakota considered the question. "Hoped," he finally said, "but did not expect." She understood. His life had taught him to temper expectations with realism. Yet here they were, against all odds, building something neither had dared to imagine after their respective losses. "Sometimes," Dakota continued, his English more fluid after months of daily conversation, "the Great Spirit takes away with one hand but gives with the other. My people have saying, the storm that tears down your lodge may clear land for a stronger home." Elizabeth thought of Thomas, his absence still an ache, but no longer the consuming grief it had once been. She thought of Dakota's wife and daughter, whose memory he honored each morning with quiet prayers. "Our losses brought us together," she acknowledged, "but it's our choices that built this." She gestured to the flourishing homestead around them. As twilight softened the landscape, James's flute music blended with desert sounds, coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through mesquite. Elizabeth felt Dakota's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as the initials on the gate latch he had carved. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would always be those who disapproved, boundaries to navigate, cultural bridges to build. But tonight, watching the stars emerge above the land they tended together, Elizabeth knew they had created something rare and precious, a home defined not by blood or background, but by choice and commitment. Dakota rose, extending his hand to her. "Come, James needs help with evening chores." She accepted his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. The same hands that had mended her fence had helped mend her heart. Together they walked toward their son, framed in the doorway of the home they now all shared, beyond the gate that bore their intertwined initials, a threshold to a future none of them could have predicted, but all had helped create.